When Dr. Beverly J. Armento was 23 years old, in her first year of teaching, and after 17 years of physical and emotional abuse, she was at her darkest point of the sole point of considering suicide. She struggled through an actual night-long beating in a simultaneous talk with God. I love the way that you put that. That's incredible. And I think many of my listeners have been in that same place.
Yes.
Along with the voices of her teachers and students who argued with her in her mind about the pros and the cons of her choices. By early dawn, she came out on the, I love this too. By early dawn, she came out on the other side of hopeless toward hope. Wow. She was clear on her purpose in life and with the drive to live and and to live free from that fear and trauma in her current life. I know that Beverly's story is going to resonate with many of you. And the bottom line is, you are not alone.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Dr. Beverly J. Armento, professor, educator, author, speaker, advocate. From an early age, she was responsible for her blind, artistic, and mentally ill mother. Though from the outside she seemed to excel at school and in the world, inside, Beverly was hurt by her mother's rage and delusions. This is going to be an amazing story. I just get goosebumps as I'm reading about your life here. And I thank you so much for being on Never Ever Give Up Hope today. So tell us your story, starting with the 20 years of struggling to survive the trauma.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Carol, for inviting me to talk with you today. And yes, indeed. I'll tell you something. I was so lucky because the first 5 years of my life were good. I had a mother and a father who loved me. I was sort of a pampered only child for 4 years. The point I want to make is that foundation time for me was positive. And I think what happened in those 5 years laid a framework for me that
Mm,
enabled me to have my strong side, my optimistic side, my hopeful side.
mm,
Um, when I was 5, there was a big turning point at the house, and from then on, I think that was when my mother suffered a serious psychological break, and
oh,
my father left, and my mother was blind. She had been blind and going blind in her early childhood. Um, she's the only member of her family, 8 children, with this rare corneal disease. And as a young child, I learned how to live with a mother who was blind. There's certain things that you need to do around the house to make sure that your mother can find things. My baby sister was born when I was 4. And so there was baby food, baby formula, baby diapers. I learned early, like at 5, I started learning how to feed the baby, change the diaper, do all of those things. And again, lucky for me, I liked doing those things. So as I grew older and had much more responsibility around the house, I didn't begrudge that. I never was angry about
Wow.
my caretaking responsibilities. But, you do develop some pretty negative coping techniques.
Okay.
I learned that I could not say certain things around my mother or do certain things because they would trigger an angry response from her. And of course, that involved me as the primary target of her rage. So I learned what those kind of cues were that set her off. And at home, I just pushed all of my emotions down. And in a situation like this, where my mother was dependent on me and yet beat me and called me nasty names, you know what? The perpetrator and the perp and the one being assaulted developed this very unhealthy codependent relationship.
Oh, really?
And I lived through, so that all of that, the suppression of emotions, the codependent relationship, uh, the lack of social relationships outside the family, because you don't know who to trust. You never tell people about what's going on at the home. So, the depth of your social relationships really is not there.
At this point, did you have to deal with self-pity?
I do not remember feeling that way, Carol.
Really?
Um, I I had more of a sense of fear
Okay.
and apprehension. But the other thing that saved me all the way through those next 17 years was school and church. I loved to learn. I was a curious kid. The teachers kind of liked me because I was always there with my hand in the air. I loved school, and school was a safe place. And those teachers, I swear to you, Carol, every single one of them was like an angel to me. I
Wow.
felt I felt like they were my teacher. They encouraged me. As I got older, they mentored me. My high school teachers encouraged me to go to college, things that I would never have thought of because, of course, we were poor also.
Right, right.
We lived in housing projects most of the time. I was active also in church. And so both of those places were really positive influences on me. And as I look back at my life, I think the idea of being hopeful was present with me all along. And it's linked to my love for school and my sense that school was safe.
Oh,
And,
okay.
and there were positive people at school. Let me give you an example. When I was just like 8 or 9, and this pattern of my mother's behavior was sort of well entrenched. I had two other, my younger sister and a half brother at that point. And my job in the morning, before I got to school, was to get these two up, get them cleaned up, get them dressed, get them breakfast,
Oh,
get,
wow.
get them to daycare, and then I got to school.
Oh, my
And
word.
every day, what drove me was my goal. And my goal was I, I had to get me to school on time. So that meant I figured out how early I had to get up, you know, get myself ready,
Right.
then get the kids ready, and then, so I had that all mapped out. And I had to leave the kitchen nice and clean. Um, as you know,
How did your mother respond to that, knowing that you were being responsible for all of it?
just took it for granted that I was
Oh,
going to do that. I
okay.
don't I don't know that she ever told me, but like I knew what the jobs were that had to be done, and I knew that they were my jobs.
Huh.
Um, I s- I do not remember how that all came to be assigned, but I was the oldest, and I was the most. I just assumed that responsibility. I was
Huh.
the one. I was the one that guided her around the community. That that took her on the bus to go do the grocery shopping. I played those leadership roles at
Wow.
home, and it was just assumed by me, and I think
Huh.
assumed by her that it was going to happen. And also, if something went wrong at the house, that meant it was my fault, you see.
Oh, my goodness.
But being hopeful, you know, was a was a characteristic of mine all the way through. And I think that, like getting to school and then getting to college, I had to figure out how was I going to get to college? How was I going to, pay for it? So I had all this little problem solving, but through my life, I set goals, and then, I had to muster up the energy to achieve those goals. And I did that for a long, long time until I crashed. And that was during my first year of teaching. My sister had left to go to nursing school. My stepfather had left. It was just mama and me and my two half brothers. And, I was the only one bringing in income my first year of teaching. And again, I did not, I do not remember begrudging paying, the rent or buying things for the apartment. Again, I assumed that was my role. And my mother
Really?
assumed it too, of course. Um, and probably just took it for granted that that was going to happen and that I would stay there forever. And I felt so, this was, I think those 17 years built up to that dark night of the soul that you were just talking about.
Right.
I did consider suicide. I was broken, and yet every day I got up and went to school and I put on my happy teacher face. Nobody knew what was going on except for one or two of my very closest friends. And of course, my sister, who had lived through it also. But I was trapped. I my choices really were kill myself or stay there forever and do the same thing.
Hmm.
And I felt that I was sort of losing my what was left of my identity. I certainly was losing my soul. And the idea that I would leave was never a viable idea. I just felt like I could not pull it off. But out of that night that I spent talking with God, talking with my angel teachers, talking back and forth with my students, all in my head. I had this giant meeting going on in my head while my mother was beating me that night. All of a sudden, Carol, I felt like if I were going to teach next year and the next year and the next year, I had to leave. I had to find myself. I could not stay there and teach. I was so broken emotionally that finally I realized the only way for me to survive and to reclaim or claim my identity was to run away from home. Run away. 23 years old, I ran away. But when I had this dark night of the soul, it was like the middle of the school year. And it was my first year, and they were fourth graders, and they loved me, and I loved them. I could not leave that moment. So again, my hope of teaching the next year helped me make a plan. I knew I had to have a concrete plan that would take me from whatever it was like March or April. That would take me to June.
Oh, okay.
How was
Okay.
I going to get to June and keep myself together? So what I decided that night was that every day as I packed up and went to school, I would take something physical, like one of my college books that I loved, a pair of underwear, a blouse that I liked, just one item. And so I did that. And at school, I had a box in the cloak closet, and I started to put things in there. And
Really?
that was my reminder. That was my link to my goal. Um, and,
Wow.
and so the last day, and by that time I did have a car. And by that time, I had a box that was full of a few precious belongings. And I put that in the car, and I drove away. My mother, when I didn't show up that day, called the police and said that she thought I'd been kidnapped. And and so the police put out a 13 state alarm for me. Um,
Oh my goodness.
yeah, 23 years old. I did drive from New Jersey, Patterson, New Jersey. I drove to Sarasota, Florida. I did have a friend help me drive to where my father lived. My father also abandoned me. He walked out when I was 5 and showed up, in the early part at the summer after I graduated from college and my sister graduated from high school. My father shows up in my life
Huh.
after paying no child support. It's one of the things my mother was so angry about is that he never, took responsibility for his own 2 girls.
Why do you
Um,
think she took that anger out on you?
She did because you know something? My sister and I looked just like our father. We did not look at all like our mother. We looked just like the father. My face, the shape of my face is, I got the square Italian chin, dark olive skin, dark hair. I guess she thought I was the representation of my father.
But if she was
Um,
blind, but well, she could see just at
oh
some point.
well, she used to touch our faces,
Oh,
so
okay.
she knew our features.
Yeah.
And my mother, when I was 9 years old, had 2 of the earliest successful corneal transplants in the country.
Huh.
Yes. And so her sight was restored. And it was a great it was a great human interest story. And all of a sudden we were famous. We were on This Is Your Life. She was on Queen for a Day,
Oh,
Strike It Rich.
really?
Yeah, all of those. And my mother was 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 great. She she could switch her personalities all the same way that I was weak Beverly at home and strong Beverly at school. My mother was an actress, a very good actress when she was on those programs. She was perfectly sane, beautiful, eloquent, had a good
Wow.
story to tell, and you know, and everybody loved my mother.
Huh.
Meanwhile, back at the farm,
Yeah,
you, it was a different story.
no kidding. Wow. Another question I have, and this is totally off the subject of what we're talking about, just curious, what is your doctorate in?
I'm in education, social studies education, which
Okay.
with a major in economics of all things, um, and psychology. You know, social studies is sort of like history, geography, political science, all of that made developmentally appropriate for children K to 12.
Okay.
And so social studies education is my field. And as a kid growing up in the projects, who would ever have envisioned getting a doctorate and being a college professor? That was never
Yeah, no
even
kidding. Wow.
that was never on the horizon.
Right, right. So now what about the next 20 years?
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another. Gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
And how
I'll
you
tell-
found hope to survive through all that hidden pain.
You know something? It was 20 years between the time I ran away and the time I finally sought psychological help. And in
Really?
those 20 years, I allowed strong Beverly to be the only Beverly. I was a great teacher. I got my master's degree. I got my doctoral degree. I even bought a house um, in a real cool neighborhood in Atlanta. You know, I was like flying. Everything was great. Meanwhile, all my old coping mechanisms were still with me. I paid no attention to my emotional, social development. I had awful relationships with men. I chose all the wrong men, and I subconsciously probably chose them because I did not really want to make any kind of commitment to people. I had an eating
Huh.
disorder that was dominating my life. I was doing all these awful things to myself. I had nightmares that my mother was going to come and kill me. I still had that fear of my mother. And I still had this oversized sense of responsibility for people in my life. Like I felt like I had to take care of my sister, take care of my brother, take care of other people. Um, just very distorted. Although I never thought twice about any of that. I never thought in those 20 years, never once did I think, oh, you really need to get some help because you're an adult living with untreated trauma. I never characterized myself that way. But as I look back and as I learn some of the literature about childhood trauma, I think that's exactly what I was. I manifested all the signs, but the 20-year marker happens when my half brother finds me and calls me and tells me that mama has died. When I learn that mama has died, all of a sudden I lose it again.
Really?
That's when I cry. That's when I scream. That's when I say, oh my God, because it's sort of like, finally, I don't have to be afraid anymore. I
Wow.
mean, on one sense, it was a relief. On the other side, I realized I was a little sick myself, and maybe I could use some help. And I found the most remarkable. He was a psychologist, but he acted kind of like you think a psychologist is supposed to act. We talked a lot. And Carol, every session I left there with new insights. One of the first
Amazing.
things he said to me after I gave him the short version of the story, he said, well, where are your mother's remains? And, they were actually in, like some unknown person's part of, the crematorium, just kind of waiting there. My half brother had not claimed them. And my psychologist said to me, Beverly, you must bury your mother.
Huh.
You must bury your mother. And you must bury little Beverly along with her. You must, like symbolically, but
Right,
he
right.
said, like, really, really. So I got in touch with a beloved uncle, my mother's youngest brother, who lives in the town where my mother grew up. There's a cemetery there where our grandparents are buried. And with my uncle's help, I got the family together. I got the cremains sent to me, took them on the plane, and we actually buried my mother. There's a nice plaque there. We had a little ceremony, and it did an awful lot for my siblings and for me to, symbolically bury, the awful part of our childhoods,
Right, right, right.
along with burying mama's cremains.
I am so intrigued by your story. And also the part that mostly has affected me and probably my audience as well is your tenacity. You are the poster girl for never ever give up hope. Everything that you did, all the goals that you set as a young child, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And I so appreciate, I know that many listeners are relating to various parts of your story as I am, even though they're very, very different. And so I appreciate you being so raw and so open. So now tell us about your books. I have two books here, Seeing Eye Girl and Life's Turning Point. So share, if you would, about those books, how you came to write them and what they're about, whatever you'd like to share.
As I came out of that work with my psychologist, I thought at that time, I was only in my 40s then. I thought at that time, someday I'm going to write about my childhood. Well, it took me a long, long time. I stayed really busy with my career and my life, as most of us do.
Right.
But in retirement, I went back to that idea. And I'm so glad I had a little maturity, uh, that came along with me. Hopefully that brought a little wisdom, and I was able to put my life in perspective.
Right.
Um, because by this time I realize if I'm going to write this story, it's not going to be an angry story. It's going to be a true story. It's going to be the real thing. It's going to show the trauma. However, I did not want to overdo the trauma, and I did not want this to be a Mama Dearest book.
Right.
I was
Right.
not out to bash my mother. And I really did not want the reader to feel sorry for the narrator. I wanted them to see the strong girl in me. Um,
Mm.
so Seeing Eye Girl is that story that I've just kind of told you today of the growing up years. And then there's with me running away from home, then there's a little epilogue of, the 20 years later.
Right.
But so that's Seeing Eye Girl. And I'd love for your readers to pick that up. You can easily pick it up on Amazon. The Life's Turning Points is a little personal reflection journal that can go along with Seeing Eye Girl. It's a chance for you, the reader, to write a little bit about your story. So I open with some vignettes from my life and then ask you about your life.
Oh,
And,
interesting.
and I must tell you, Carol, while we're talking about writing, right now I am writing a story about another memoir about the father. And
Oh,
this part of my life is going to be the adult living with untreated trauma. So I'll deal with that topic in a little more depth in
right.
this next book. And that's going to be called Willpower.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, yeah. So I've got a website. It's just my name, Beverly Armento Author. And on that website, you can keep up with what I'm doing and what I'm writing and the podcast I'm on. You'll be able to find this podcast on my website. Um, and so I'm so excited about putting this on my website, Carol.
So we kind of covered all the bases. Is there anything else that you would like to share, or what would you like to say to the audience, people who may be, relating in some ways to your story?
I want you to keep the idea of hope in mind. For me, hope as a kid was kind of a coping mechanism.
Mm.
And, I had a lot of coping mechanisms, and most of them were kind of maladaptive and had negative consequences for me over the long run, like suppressing my emotions. But thank goodness I was a hopeful kid.
Right.
And that's a positive coping strategy. I used it to help me get to school. And, every goal I I set out, what are the steps I have to take? And luckily I had a lot of energy and a lot of motivation to achieve my goals. And that's what it takes. You know, Once you set a goal, it's up to you to muster the energy to reach that goal. And if you keep setting a little goals and achieving them, then you can make bigger goals.
That's
uh,
right.
like I made the big goal of saving my life.
Right, right,
That's
right.
pretty big. Yeah,
Yeah.
but hope, it's all about hope. It's all about hope. And hope drives resilience and persistence and fortitude. You know, if you don't have hope, there's no reason to be resilient.
Hope drives resilience,
Yes,
fortitude, and what was the other one?
like, fortitude and motivation, all of those, your agency, your willingness to go after your goal. If you don't have hope that you can achieve this goal, you will never get off your butt.
I like that.
To work
Willingness.
for it.
As an educator, did you notice some of the signs in some of your students that concerned you that they might be going through something that you went through?
Carol, I think so. I think you come out of this situation, or at least I did, with a great deal of empathy and compassion,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
your eyes, your in part, I think my eyes see a lot of things because I lived with someone who is blind, and you become the eyes for that person. So you've got to look at the details. You've got to look at the clues. And I looked at kids with a sense of love toward them. I wasn't seeking to analyze them in any way. I wanted to love them all equally. I wanted them all to be successful. And I knew that was my job, to set them up in situations where they could be successful. Um, but you can see, and kids, a lot of kids are just like me. They cover it. You know,
Right.
I tried to cover my physical bruises, but they did sometimes stick out. Teachers probably must have seen that. But I came to school with a smiling face.
Mm,
I did not put my head down and cry. I
right.
did not cower in the corner. There are kids that do that, and that's a real obvious sign. But most kids cover if something awful, awful is going on in their home. I am in touch with many of my former students who were fourth,
Oh,
fifth, and sixth graders when I taught them. They are now 70 some odd, and many of them say, Miss Armento, when I was in fifth grade with you, it was a rough time at home, but I always felt safe in your class. I always
oh my
felt like
goodness.
I always felt like I wanted to be there. I wanted to learn, and you made learning fun. And that's great feedback.
What a legacy. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, when my old students, and now they're old, tell me these things, I feel like I could die now. It's worth it. Yeah, you know, I had a wonderful career. It's it. I had a great life as an educator, and one of my themes and my platforms now is to celebrate teachers and to help people realize once again how important a teacher is in kids' lives. We've kind of demeaned that profession in many ways,
Right.
and it's time to turn our attitudes around on that.
I think that a lot of that is because it goes both ways and people gravitate to the negative of what they've seen and like in the news or personal experience, wouldn't you say?
I agree. I
So
I
it's
agree.
it's sad and it's imbalanced. And when you and I grew up, we had a different attitude towards teachers too than what is
Oh
now.
yes, the
You know that
teacher was to be revered.
exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been wonderful, and I don't want to cut you off too early. If there's anything else that you
Oh,
want to
I
share,
I think I think I've said a lot, and
okay, Okay.
I don't have anything that's burning, but
Okay.
but I've so enjoyed our conversation, and I hope there's some kernel in there that people take away.
There will be, and be a different one for different people. So
Yes.
absolutely. Again, I thank you, Dr. Beverly Armento, for being on Never, Ever Give Up Hope.
Thank you so much, Carol.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.